Buddhist literature has played a pivotal role in the evolution and study of the various Buddhist traditions. The canonical text, such as the Tripitaka, which contains the sutras, Vinayana, and the Abhidharma, have been the objects of meditation and study for thousands of years. Non-canonical texts have played an important role as well, offering interpretations and reflections on the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhist literature has evolved over the centuries, from the sutras of early Theravada and Mahayana traditions to the Shastras of Tibet. Scholars have offered their interpretations of what the Buddha taught since the Kathavatu, or points of controversy at the Third Buddhist Council. Buddhist influence does not only extend to scholarly writings, though. Many authors, poets, and songwriters have been inspired by the teachings of the Buddha. In the 1800s, a period of philosophical and cultural growth known as Transcendentalism emerged. Transcendentalism was characterized by many authors and thinkers, but one man stands out in particular, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau's landmark piece of literature, Walden, documents an experiment of lifestyle he undertook over the course of 2 years. Thoreau's book, Walden, can easily be considered modern Buddhist literature. He expressed a great many thoughts and ideas in his book that are consistent with Buddhist teaching, and his very lifestyle in many ways exemplified basic Buddhist ideals. Thoreau was one of the many great thinkers that came out of the Transcendentalist era. Transcendentalist thought gained recognition in the 19th century when Ralph Waldo Emerson published his famous book, Nature. The Transcendental movement was in many ways a revolution for the individual, a rebellion against old religious traditions, and a departure from solely rational thinking for a more intuitive and insightful approach. Transcendentalist thinkers believe strongly in the individual's experience as truth. If one intuitively accepted an idea as truth, truth must be present. This idea is one of the most famous teachings of the Buddha himself. Buddhist, Hindu, and Far Eastern ideas, literature, and philosophy greatly influenced the development of Transcendentalism, as well as the thoughts of individual transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau. The different perspectives provided a sort of counterpoint to the primarily Christian religious views prevalent at the time. Vedic thought in particular was an important influence on Transcendentalism. During this time, philosophers often looked to the East for new ideas and inspiration. The Hindu sacred text, Bhagavad Gita, for example, contains many themes found in Transcendentalist literature, as in this excerpt.
A person who neither rejoices upon achieving something pleasant nor laments upon obtaining something unpleasant, who is self-intelligent, unbewildered, who knows the science of God, is to be understood as already situated in transcendence.
Vedic thought often appears in Thoreau's writings. He was, to some degree, obsessed with the Bhagavad Gita and the stories of Krishna and other Hindu gods and goddesses, to the point where Eastern imagery and meditations permeated his everyday life.
In the morning, I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. I go to my well for water, and lo, there I meet the servant of Brahman, priest of Brahma, and Vishnu and Indra. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges.
With reverence and excitement, Thoreau incorporates Hindu literature and thought throughout Walden, especially the Bhagavad Gita, often comparing Eastern ideas with Western standards of philosophy. Not only Vedic thought, but that of Confucian and Hindu philosophy also greatly influenced Thoreau. Despite the recurring Buddhist themes and Eastern influence present in Thoreau's writing, he can hardly be considered a modern Buddhist scholar. In fact, although he was a major contributor to the Transcendentalist era and was largely influenced by the ideas of Emerson and Eastern religion and philosophy, there is no mention that he studied or was particularly fond of any Buddhist text or Buddhist ideals specifically. Thoreau was not drawn toward any particular Buddhist tradition and did not even actively seek enlightenment by most Buddhist standards. So why can his famous work, Walden, be considered modern Buddhist literature? Thoreau rarely mentioned the Buddha, the Buddhist teachings, or anything to do with Buddhism in his writings. However, what he did not understand in theory, he discovered in practice. Through his Buddha-like lifestyle of simplicity and quiet meditation and solitude, he rose to a deeper understanding of life and his purpose in the vast cosmos. His reflections and thoughts on various aspects of society were distinctly Buddhist in nature, some of which will be discussed later. Thoreau sought solitude from the distractions of everyday life. He wanted to write a book and experiment with self-reliance and simple living. He decided to retreat to the woods, settling on the edge of Walden Pond, a short distance away from Concord, Massachusetts. An outsider's view of his departure from civilized society can be compared to a common misconception about Buddhism. People not acquainted with Buddhist thought may see Buddhism as a rather negative tradition, with its doctrine of anatman, no self, shunyata, emptiness, and a plethora of other negative-sounding concepts. Similarly, one might think that Thoreau's retreat to the woods near Walden Pond was one driven by bitterness and disgust with the world. One might suppose that he lived alone and cranky, a hermit from society. Quite the opposite was true. He departed from society in an effort to explore and experience a completely self-reliant lifestyle. Additionally, by separating himself from civilization, he hoped to be able to critique it in an objective way. Clearly, Thoreau was not driven by negative motives or outward ill will. In fact, according to his nearest neighbors, he was quite joyful and found pleasure in the solitary life. Thoreau spent 2 years by Walden Pond, but he condensed the 2-year experience into one for the purposes of his book. He highlighted the seasons and used them as a metaphor for the seasons of human life. Thoreau constructed his own house from the trees he felled in the woods. He borrowed tools when necessary and bought supplies when he had no other options, but otherwise he was very self-sufficient. He raised his own crops and ate only what he grew. He went on long walks and spent a lot of time around Walden Pond. His extended solitary experience led him to a much more contemplative existence. He considered in his book the surface of the water and saw deep spiritual meaning in the earthbound entity reflecting the heavens, as the human soul is bound to earth but reflects the peaceful realm beyond this world. Despite Thoreau's unfamiliarity with Buddhist philosophy, many distinctly Buddhist ideals appear throughout Walden. Thoreau himself actually sometimes appears quite similar to the Buddha in thought and desire.
In any weather, at any hour of the day or night, I have been anxious to improve the nick of time, and notch it on my stick too, to stand on the meeting of two eternities, the past and future, which is precisely the present moment. To toe that line, I will gladly tell all that I know about it, and never paint a no admittance sign on my gate.
Thoreau embarked on a journey quite similar in many ways to that of the Buddha. He journeyed on his own, lived a life of meditation and reflection, and eventually, through his effort, strength of will, and perseverance, came to realize a middle way between the two eternities, as Thoreau put it, the present moment, living without care of yesterday or tomorrow, simply living off of what the present had to offer. The Buddha did this with his Sangha, eating only what others would give, not worrying about the past or the future, but meditating on the Dharma of the present moment. Thoreau shut himself away from the world in order to view the world in an objective manner, to be free from the passions, demands, desires, social obligations, and material needs that arise from living in society. More than this, though, Thoreau did not want to conceal any knowledge or understanding he gained through his experiences. Like the Buddha, he wanted to share everything he could, and gladly would, perhaps so that others would learn from him or be inspired to go out into the world and experience it for themselves. Thoreau touches briefly the Buddhist idea of pratitya samutpada, or co-originating interdependence, especially in his discussion of material possessions. This viewpoint is akin to the Buddhist teachings on attachment to things of this world. The more possessions one has, the more opportunities exist to become materialistic. This truth was reflected in the lifestyle of the first followers of the Buddha. Early Buddhist monks owned only one set of clothes, a begging bowl, a razor, tweezers, nail clippers, a water filter, a needle, and a bag of medicines. According to the second noble truth, samudaya, the cause of suffering, or dukkha, is attachment or desire. Eliminating desire